I think we can all agree that sex crimes, and especially sex crimes against children, are some of the most abhorrent and vile acts that anyone can commit. I also think that it isn't too controversial to state that those who sexually abuse children should go to jail. And there's really no exception to that rule. But increasingly, judges seem to think differently. There has been a number of cases recently that have caught my attention because judges have let off sex offenders. Judges have let these sexual predators walk free and refused to send them to jail. For example, I read this from the Metro, and I quote, "The young girls were actually investigators from the organisation The Innocence Keepers, who had been messaging Mark Presley online. The 49-year-old sent hundreds of messages before saying he wanted to have sex with the girls, telling one he didn't want to make her pregnant. Members of the group confronted Presley during a sting operation in Blackpool, where he said he would hand over a stick of rock and presents for special little girls if they met him. An hour-long film of the confrontation and his subsequent arrest was posted on Facebook. But at Preston Crown Court, where he admitted to inciting a girl aged 13 to 15 to engage in sexual activity and trying to meet a girl following grooming, he was spared jail. Judge Andrew Woolman said there were no real victims in the case and claimed Presley had suffered already due to the disability cerebral ataxia, which means he uses a walker. Imposing a 3-year community order, the judge said the sentence was the best way of helping society at large, and added the defendant himself is a vulnerable and pathetic individual and is clearly very distressed." End quote. I know that some sick people, will argue that the judge was right, that the paedophile in this case was set up, that he was tricked. They will argue that the judge was correct to let him go free, as after all, he wasn't actually talking to real girls. He was talking to adults posing as girls, and he didn't actually sexually assault anyone, despite that clearly being his intention. These same people may also try to tell you that if a man was actually arrested for a real sexual assault of a child, then he would be jailed. Well, rather disturbingly, that simply isn't the case. I read this from the Mirror, and I quote, "A paedophile preyed on a terrified little girl and left her with a lifetime of mental scars. But Stephen Oates has walked free from court, even though he has admitted to 2 sex offences against children. The 35-year-old pervert pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a child under 9 and an unrelated charge of engaging in sexual activity in the presence of a child under the age of 16 at Newcastle Crown Court. But his young victim's mum, who thought she would see justice done at court, was horrified when Oates of Whitley Bay walked free after being sentenced to just 6 months in jail, suspended for 24 months." End quote. Here we have a case of a man who did sexually assault a child, and a child under the age of 9. And it wasn't his only offence of that nature. He was also guilty of engaging in sexual activity in the presence of a child under the age of 16. Yet despite these 2 very serious charges, both of which he pleaded guilty to, he walked free from court thanks to a seemingly very lenient judge. So we are starting to see a pattern here. And these cases of sex offenders walking free aren't just isolated cases. When I was researching this topic, I found many more instances like this, and I would encourage everyone to do their own research into this. And whilst we're on the topic, we cannot forget the Islamic grooming scandal here in Britain, where the British state, including politicians, the media, and the police actively colluded to cover up the sexual abuse of tens of thousands of white British girls by Islamic gangs, whilst at the same time threatening to investigate parents who actually reported these crimes to the police. I read this from the Star, and I quote, "Two fathers whose daughters were victims of child sex exploitation tracked down their abusers only to be arrested by police themselves. The dads had attempted to remove their daughters from the houses where abuse was taking place, but they were the ones who were then arrested by police." Professor Jay's inquiry said police often treated victims with contempt, frequently arresting them while taking no action against those committing offences. Her report said, in 2 of the cases, fathers tracked down their daughters and tried to remove them from houses where they were being abused, only to be arrested themselves when police were called to the scene. End quote. So here we have another example of an arm of the British state, in this case the police, allowing paedophiles to walk free. But this case is made all the more worse because the police actually used their powers to silence the victims of abuse and their families, even threatening the fathers of the victims with arrest for attempting to free their daughters. I am not going to delve any further into this case, as I've already covered it in great depth. I did an entire video about the case of the Rotherham Grooming Scandal, where over 1,400 girls were sexually abused by these Muslim grooming gangs in one single and quite small town. That video is linked in the description below, so if you're not familiar with the case, please give it a watch later. But whilst more and more paedophiles walk free, and we now know the British police were actively trying to cover up the Islamic grooming scandal, some may make the mistake of thinking this is all just a modern phenomenon, that treating sex offenders with kid gloves is just part of the modern day politically correct agenda and the cultural Marxist drive for sexual liberalisation. But sadly, they would be wrong for thinking so. The British state closing ranks, silencing victims and covering up evidence to protect paedophiles is sadly nothing new at all. It's been going on for decades. There have been numerous historical cases of large-scale child abuse by leading members of the British establishment that were covered up by the media, the police, and those who held political power. Over the last few years, numerous extremely large scandals have finally surfaced and been given the public scrutiny that they rightfully deserve. Numerous members of the political establishment have been implicated, as well as celebrities and leading broadcasters, all of whom were at one time or another aided by the police. This resulted in the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, or the IICSA, which was announced by the then British Home Secretary, Theresa May, on the 7th of July 2014. The inquiry was established to examine how the country's institutions handled their duty of care to protect children from sexual abuse. I read this from the IICSA website, and I quote, "The inquiry has launched 13 investigations into a broad range of institutions identified on the basis of the panel's criteria for selection of investigations. The investigations will give a voice to victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, enable the inquiry to understand how institutions have failed to protect children from sexual abuse, and make practical recommendations to ensure better institutional protection for children in the future. The inquiry's investigative work underpins the public hearings, and hearings will be held during the course of most, if not all, of the investigations. Each investigation will conclude with a report that will set out the inquiry's conclusions on institutional failings and identify practical recommendations for change. These 13 investigations constitute the first phase of the inquiry's work, and further investigations will be announced as the inquiry progresses." End quote. However, all did not go well with the IICSA's campaign to get to the bottom of the issue, mainly because the issue of sexual abuse within the British establishment is so large and so far-reaching, it was almost impossible to tackle. I read this from The Guardian. It was originally published on the 12th of September 2016, and I quote, Lowell Goddard has told us what we know, that sexual crimes against children are too big, too tolerated, and altogether too much. Goddard, the New Zealand judge who resigned from the inquiry into historical child abuse last month, said in a memo to MPs that there was an inherent problem in the sheer scale and size of the inquiry. It was set up in 2014 after a tsunami of scandal. The deaths of prolific but protected abusers, BBC DJ Jimmy Savile and Liberal politician Cyril Smith, and long-standing suspicions about other Westminster politicians. Speculation about organised networks of men sexually exploiting children amplified the clamour to do something. The inquiry announced 13 initial investigations. Goddard is the third chair to step down, after the previous two appointees resigned. Her memo, drawing attention to the unmanageable scale of the problem, has encouraged cynicism and scepticism. But scale should be no deterrent, nor should the shame that suffocates survivors of sexual assault. End quote. So here we have a body set up to investigate these historical paedophile rings within the British establishment and historical cases of sex abuse. But the problem is so widespread, so large, and of such a scale, 3 chairs of the inquiry had stepped down in its first 2 years of operation, before any investigations were even close to a conclusion. One can only speculate to how much resistance this whole inquiry must have met from deep within the British establishment. And those who are listening carefully might be wondering why a judge from New Zealand was chosen to head up the inquiry. Well, quite simply, that's how far the IICSA had to go to find a chair who wasn't in some way connected to parts of the British state being investigated. Again, another indicator of how widespread the issue of child abuse actually is within the British establishment. Adding further credence to this line of thinking is the fact that last year, one of the largest groups representing the victims of these horrific crimes withdrew from the inquiry, claiming that the inquiry was not fit for purpose. Again, I read this from The Guardian, and I quote, "A victims group has said it is formally withdrawing from the National Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, claiming the investigation is not fit for purpose. Survivors of organised and institutional abuse said it announced the decision with deep regret, but felt the inquiry was not serving the needs of victims. The group said survivors have been totally marginalised from the process, adding that the inquiry had descended into a very costly academic report writing and literature review exercise. It comes after the Shirley Oaks Survivors Association, one of the largest victims groups involved, pulled out of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, describing it as a stage-managed event which has lurched from crisis to crisis." End quote. So here we seem to have an inquiry in name only, an inquiry that seems to struggle for clear leadership, an inquiry compromised by the sheer size and scale of the problem, and an inquiry that the victims of these crimes have no faith in. But looking at the article in The Guardian in more detail, let's have a look at a few of the high-profile cases that it cites. It obviously mentions the Jimmy Savile case, which is the most high-profile and notable case that has broken in the media. Most of you will have heard of it, but for those who haven't, Jimmy Savile was a British DJ and television presenter who worked for the British state broadcaster, the BBC. But for those not familiar with the case, I read this from The Independent, and I quote, "Jimmy Savile raped and sexually abused victims as young as 9 and was caught on camera carrying out his lechery at least once while working for the BBC, according to a leaked draft of a report examining the paedophiles' misconduct at the corporation. Investigative news site Exaro has published findings of Dame Janet Smith's review into the depraved entertainer and BBC television presenter who was exposed as a prolific sexual predator and paedophile a year after his death in 2011. The review, which has said it will publish its report in 6 weeks' time, said the leaked findings were from an early draft of the report and that significant changes had since been made to its contents and conclusions. According to Exaro, the review's findings highlight multiple rapes and indecent assault on girls and boys at the hands of Savile, and inappropriate sexual conduct with teenagers above 16, all in some way associated with the BBC. 3 of Savile's victims were only 9 years old, it says. Exaro reports that Smith criticises the BBC for a very deferential culture, with many BBC employees telling the review that they had heard about Savile's predatory reputation but feared reporting their concerns to managers. End quote. Savile's crimes are notorious, but it should also be made clear that Savile had friends in high places. He was regularly pictured with other celebrities, members of parliament, prime ministers, and even members of the royal family. In fact, he was even knighted by the Queen and was given the title Sir. Jimmy Savile was also a darling of the BBC, the British state broadcaster. And the BBC itself is not a stranger to these kind of allegations, with the company being accused of having a culture that protected sex offenders like Savile, who wasn't the only BBC employee to be found to be a child abuser. Another case was of that of Stuart Hall. He was also a veteran broadcaster at the BBC and was also bestowed an honour by the Queen. Hall was appointed as Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, in the 2012 New Year's Honours for services to broadcasting and charity, although that was annulled after his convictions for sex offences. The other high-profile sex offender mentioned in the Guardian article was Cyril Smith, a Liberal Party MP who died in 2010. After his death, a series of sordid stories emerged detailing his abuse of young boys in Rochdale. I read this from The Guardian, and I quote, MI5 was told that prosecutors lied to journalists about their decision not to press charges against the late MP Cyril Smith, but took no action as its role was to defend the realm. An inquiry is heard. A police investigation into the Liberal politician's alleged sexual abuse of young boys at care homes in Rochdale ended in 1970, when the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, Sir Norman Skelhorn, concluded there was not enough evidence to prosecute him. This was despite a police report that warned Smith was sheltering behind a veneer of respectability and had used his unique position to indulge in a sordid series of indecent episodes with young boys towards whom he had a special responsibility. Smith died in 2010 and was never prosecuted for his alleged crimes. End quote. And yes, you heard all that correctly. The British Secret Service knew that there was a cover-up, but did nothing as they claimed it wasn't their role to do so. In fact, they said it was their job to defend the realm. Does that mean defending the British establishment? And if so, does that mean covering up establishment crimes against children? And isn't it convenient that most of these establishment sex offenders are always exposed after they have died, essentially meaning that they can never face justice and their victims can never see their cases brought before a court? But what happens when these historic cases come to light and the individual accused is still alive? Well, this happened in the case of Greville Janner, who sat in the House of Lords as a Labour peer. The Crown Prosecution Service refused to bring charges against him due to his health. I read this from The Independent, and I quote, "Despite evidence that the frail 86-year-old politician committed some of the most serious sexual crimes imaginable, the Crown Prosecution Service announced that a fourth and final opportunity to bring criminal charges against him will now not be pursued because of the severity of his dementia." The Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, said sufficient evidence had been found to bring 22 22 charges dating back to the late 1960s against Lord Janner, including 4 counts of buggery against a minor. But medical experts had established the peer was not fit to stand trial, and it was not in the public interest to pursue him. Ms. Saunders added that enough evidence had also previously been found to prosecute the Labour peer on 3 occasions in 1991, 2002 and 2007 for alleged sex abuse. She said it was a matter of deep regret that no charges were ever brought, but stopped short of issuing an apology. End quote. So there you have it. The CPS had 4 chances to prosecute Janner and even admitted they had enough evidence to do so. But despite the severity of the allegations and the wealth of evidence, they refused to. Eventually, on the 4th occasion, the CPS cited his ill health as a reason not to prosecute and stated it was not in the public interest to pursue charges, allowing Janner to die an unconvicted man and those who accused him to go without justice. So you can see a pattern forming here. The British state, which includes the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, the state broadcaster and the judiciary, are all committed to not only covering up the cases of Islamic grooming that are currently plaguing the nation, but they also have a long and ugly history of covering up establishment sex abuse, which reaches right the way to the top and involves individuals who had access to the highest levels of the establishment, including access to prime ministers and members of the royal family. I believe it is fair to state that child sexual abuse is like a poisonous weed that has its roots embedded in every organ of the state. On January the 31st of this year, the first of the preliminary hearings for the IICSA investigation will be held. The first preliminary hearing is in relation to the extent of any institutional failures to protect children in the care of Nottingham City and Nottinghamshire councils from sexual abuse and exploitation. This will be followed by public hearings commencing on the 1st of October 2018. A further preliminary hearing in relation to the Children in Custodial Institutions investigation will take place on the 1st of February 2018. You can get more information on all of this from the IICSA website, which is linked in the description below. But as I stated earlier, don't be holding your breath waiting for real answers, as I'm sure the victims of these horrific crimes won't be holding their breath either. When I've said in the past that we need to sweep away the British establishment and replace the system, this is another very good reason as to why that is the case. Our establishment is rotten to the core, and the rot in this case is the ugliest and most vile of rots. The acceptance and cover-up of wide-scale paedophilia and child abuse, and in a just and fair world, all of those that had anything to do with that abuse, whether it be carrying it out or covering it up, should at the very least be spending a very long time behind bars. Not only do we need a nationalist government to actually ensure that the victims of these crimes get the justice they deserve, we also need a nationalist government to ensure the safety and future of our children, and to ensure that those children are safe from sexual predators. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.